It's my pleasure to introduce Jason Keirstead. He can introduce himself, but we worked together on the Styx taxi standards back in the day, and he's a great guy, and you should totally listen to whatever he has to say, I think.
Thanks, Trey. Hopefully it's not just a half hour of mindless ramblings, but here to talk a little bit about a concept I like to call collective defense intelligence. And it's going to be some high-level ideas, but essentially, trying to push us, and there's actually been a lot of good conversations about this today already, the session that was just prior to this, as well as another one earlier this morning about using standards to accelerate some of your threat detection programs. So there's been some great content along these lines already, but I'm going to kind of take it up another level and talk about, let's say, kind of a North Star vision for where I think we need to get as a community. So who I am, really brief, although I hate doing these types of slides, but everybody else is doing it, so, oh, my flag is moved. So I'm a Canadian. I'm from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. I have over 20 years in experience in threat management. So I'm currently the CTO of Threat at IBM Security. I lead the technical direction of all of our threat products, so our QRadar SIEM, the SOAR, our Reaqta EDR, our recent Randori acquisition, XForce Exchange, all of that type of stuff. I've been involved in open source since I was in high school, so since I was a little kid with my first PC and I threw NetBSD 2.2 on it or something to that effect. I'm currently also on the board of directors at OASIS Open, which is the home of a lot of the standards that have been discussed over the past couple of days, like Styx, Taxi, Cacao, Open C2. I'm also in the steering committee for another standard called OCSF, which is a pretty exciting thing going on. Collaboration between Amazon, Splunk, ourselves, CrowdStrike, and a whole bunch of other major vendors to agree on a common logging format. So if you're not familiar with that OCSF project, check that out as well. I'm also involved at the Open Source Security Foundation, MITRE Center for Threat Informed Defense, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'm kind of like, this is my passion, is open security and open standards. And, kind of level set the talk today about what collective defense, why am I talking about collective defense? And it's because where we are today, traditional cybersecurity, it might sound kind of harsh, but I'd argue it's broken. It's been broken for a long time, and while we're making a lot of steps to improve it, we still see, that most security teams are not sharing enough data. Even those that are sharing data tend to focus on sharing threat intelligence, tactical IOCs, the really mature stuff. Really mature folks might even get to the point of sharing, strategic threat intelligence, but very few people are actually sharing and collaborating around detections. Next to no one is collaborating around playbooks, which was kind of the topic this morning, which I'll get into later. So there's a lot more work that we can do and a lot more that we can progress if we really want to try to level up our, what I call our collective defense. Another thing that we see is that there's a huge demand for this. If you talk to, anyone here at this conference or any of your executives, all the CISOs and CIOs at organizations worldwide, everyone recognizes that integrations and reducing vendor lock-in is incredibly important to them. People do believe in the importance of standards and the importance of making things interoperate, and people claim they want more support for standards. But we don't necessarily see the same momentum in industry. Like it's almost like we say we want one thing, but we're not confident enough to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to what we're trying to accomplish. So if these are kind of some of the challenges that we're trying to deal with, then you add on to this the skills shortage, right? That I'm sure everybody here has seen, is experienced. There's a lot of debate online about what is the real degree. Is there a real skill shortage? I'll tell you, it is real. Anybody who runs a SOC knows how hard it is to find those people that have the deep cybersecurity expertise. And yes, we all love to, help and train and grow the next generation, but that takes time as well. And in the meantime, we're under nonstop, constant threat. So it is a difficult situation. So we as an industry have to figure out what are the force multipliers, what are the ways that we can work together to reduce the barriers of entry for new people, to lower the barrier of interoperability between products, increase the fidelity of information that we're sharing between these things, and get to the point where we're all collaborating together more effectively. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off with this idea of detection as code. I'm sure a lot of people in here are familiar with this idea that's been floating around. If you haven't heard of it, there's this concept called detection as code. It's actually called a couple of different things over the past couple of years, depending on, John Lambert called it the GitHubification of information security. Anton Chuvakian's the one who coined this idea of detection as code. But when you hear people talk about detection as code, what comes to your mind? Right? Are we talking about, do SOC engineers have to write code now? Because most security people I know nowadays, they're not coders. A lot of the new generation didn't come up in the same fields that I did and perhaps other people in this room have, where you come in with a computer science background, you start as a developer, you eventually fall into information security. The current generation, we're hiring people who focus on cybersecurity as a profession from the start, and that's fantastic, but that means that they don't necessarily come with the software engineering experience. So when we talk about detection as code, what does that mean? Hopefully it doesn't mean people have to write code to do their detections, and it doesn't, right? When you really dig into it, what all these different people are talking about is actually applying processes to our detections the same way that software engineering disciplines work. And before I get into that, I just want to highlight, again, when we use terms like detection as code, we're forgetting about all the other pieces. What about threat intelligence? What about response plans? What about the automations? It's really, we have to start thinking about this more holistically, because that end-to-end package or bundle, or what I'm going to call here in a few slides defense intelligence, is really what we need to be collaborating around, not just the detections. So why do I think detection as code is not an accurate term? I prefer to think of it more like defense ops, right? So if you're familiar with software engineering, you're familiar with the concept of DevOps or DevSecOps that's emerged over the past 5 years. And it's the idea of, if you're delivering your software to your customers, very often via SaaS, but it's not always a SaaS, that you're continuously improving it. And there's this cycle of you build your code, you test your code, you validate your code, it then gets pushed to staging, there's another additional level of validation, and a lot of this is automated. And once that final level of validation is there, it can get pushed to production with full confidence that it's very unlikely to have any defects or bugs in it, because you've done all that testing. And defense ops, or detection as code, is about applying those principles to your cybersecurity operations. Right? So there's three key ideas that when people talk about this, and you read a lot of the blog posts and articles and papers, there's three key concepts that are fundamental to it. The first is this idea of test-driven development, right? You don't write detections for something that you don't actually have a working TTP or automated red team exercise for, because you need to be able to test your detections. You shouldn't be just writing them in a bubble. Second is the idea of composability and reuse. Right? So when you're writing those detections, that you're not trying to write the Uber detection that specifically looks for APT 29. And when this alerts, I know I have APT 29, but that means that the detection's got to be extremely granular and cover the whole end-to-end scenario, as opposed to say, the composability and reuse mantra says, instead of doing that, you should write atomic detections that look for those specific techniques and tools that APT 29 is using, and then only if all of those things match, or they match in a certain sequence, then you know that you have APT 29. And the reason that's better is because now these things are composable, and you can reuse those detections. And we're going to get to why that's really important in a second. The final is this idea of version-controlled automated workflow, right? So when you're building your detections, when you're building those playbooks, when you're building those response plans, that it is versioned somehow, either you're using Git or you're using a purpose-built tool that has versioning, Jira or something. And you have that automated workflow so that it's reproducible, right? A lot of this is about building a program where the stuff is reproducible over and over. So that when you bring in that new person, that new SOC engineer, that they can just fall into that program and know how to build that detection and have it cascade through to production, because it follows the exact same sequence that happened a month ago when somebody built another detection. So I talked a little bit about this idea of defense intelligence, right? What do I mean when I say defense intelligence? And we talk a lot about threat intelligence, right? So I've got a definition here, it's from Gartner, on what threat intelligence is. We can debate about how accurate it is. I think it's more or less pretty good. They say threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge, i.e. context mechanisms, indicators, blah, 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 about existing or emerging menaces or hazards to your assets, right? So you have an environment, you have assets. I have threat intelligence. These are talking about the hazards to those. Well, what is defense intelligence then? And this is my definition. Defense intelligence is about what is the tactical curated knowledge that you use to defend against those threats. Things like hunt scenarios, alerting rules, your detections, manual and automated responses, those playbooks, that'll mitigate any validated and quantified menaces to your assets, right? And collective defense intelligence then is when we, as a community, can build that together instead of building it in isolation. We're going to talk about how do we do that? What are the things that enable us to do that? And what are the things that are perhaps missing along that journey that are stopping us from being able to do that? So how do we enable collective defense, right? So one of the things I want to talk about is how there's a trade-off between secrecy and action in threat intelligence and counterintelligence, right? It's really interesting, the timing. The session previous was kind of talking about this, right? The emergence of the evolution from trust communities to action communities. So we've got to try to figure out how to pivot more in the continuum of from closed to open. There's this kind of, I would argue, a series of logical fallacies that lead us down this path that say, we don't want to share all of our detections in real time because then the adversaries will know that we can detect them, and then they will change their behavior, and then we won't be able to detect them anymore because they'll know that we know that they know that we know that, et cetera, right? And it's true, that'll happen, right? That will inevitably happen. But I would strongly argue that we err as an industry far too much on the secrecy side of that continuum, right? Because if you think about things from, say, the 80-20 rule, if 80% of the things that you have to face are commodity threats, and if that's true for every single person at this conference, and I would argue it is, right? That's where we're spending all of our bandwidth and all of our time. And if you want to be able to focus on that other 20%, you've got to figure out how to shrink that 80% and make it much more expensive for them to operate. And the best way to make things expensive for the adversary is to have as many people as possible, get as many defenses as possible in place as fast as possible for whatever campaign is going on right now. And that happens when we as an industry figure out that it's better for us to share more, collaborate more, and do things faster, and not worry so much about whether or not we're telling the adversary how much we know about them, right? Obviously, there's nuances to all of this, right? And when you're talking about nation state, it changes the whole equation because there's different sets of motivations there. But again, 80-20 rule, are 80% of the things that you have to deal with nation state adversaries? No, they're not. Right? So how do we free up more resources to deal with those more complex problems? It's by reducing the majority of the things that we have to deal with. Another thing that I see a lot that I want to highlight is this idea that everyone's a special snowflake, right? You hear, when people are talking about sharing their information, and you can often, you can see, I've literally seen this at a couple of different talks here. We have this cool thing that we're doing in our environment, but asterisk, it may not be applicable to your environment because we're special, and so we're not totally sure how much sharing this will help the community. Well, I'm here to tell you, I work with thousands and thousands of customers all over the world. And it bothers me to no end when I'm talking to a CISO at one organization on Monday and talking to another one on Tuesday, and they are dealing with the exact same problem, exact same challenges. They're trying to do the exact same thing, and they're not working together. They don't know each other. They don't know that this is going on. And you can take that and multiply it tens of thousands of times across this whole industry. Yes, everyone has a unique environment, but we are not as unique as we think we are. We have a lot more in common than I believe most people realize. We're all fighting the same war, we're fighting the same threats, more or less. Again, the 80-20 rule. Yes, 20% is unique, but if the 80% is not unique, that's what we need to be focusing on, not always over-rotating to that 20% of uniqueness, because that's what will enable us to force multiply, and it's where we need to get to. So if those are some of the challenges, right, how do we start to look to resolve some of those? We have this challenge where if we're going to collaborate and share, our folks in the SOC, they can't be jacks of all trades and masters of none. They can't have to be experts in Defender, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, Carbon Black. Like it's impossible to keep up with all the different things that are going on. And if you and I are using different tools, how are we able to effectively collaborate? We also have the problem where folks do want to collaborate, and I think most people do, right? Most people here do. That's why FIRST exists, after all. But we don't always necessarily know how to do it. What's the best way to do it? An example I give all the time is, a couple years ago when Log4j happened, and I use this example just because everyone knows Log4j, and everyone's probably tired of hearing about it, but it's still a good example. When Log4j happened, right, and the entire world was on fire for about 48 hours, trying to find this in their environment, literally the only place that people could go to kind of keep up to date on the latest state of affairs was Twitter, right? Looking for Log4j on Twitter, because what was going on was everyone in the community was posting all the latest Sigma rules that they wrote to hunt for Log4j, and here's a KQL query I wrote for Sentinel, finds Log4j. And then someone would reply, and here's an update to it, here's a new version, whatever. And to me, that's the perfect example of, Twitter is interesting, but it's not an ideal tool to be doing that for a whole plethora of reasons. We talked about this notion of defense ops and how you have to continuous improvement, versioning, how do you have trust? None of that exists in a forum like Twitter, and Twitter is kind of like the best that we have, almost. There's a whole bunch of ISACs and ISAOs, that are springing up that are kind of tackling this problem, and the previous talk was talking about this a bit. But I'd argue strongly that there needs to be, kind of a more open and public and community resource to enable this type of collaboration. And you see movements in, say, the Sigma community. People will point to GitHub and say, well, there's this amazing GitHub repository with thousands of Sigma rules. Everyone's free to contribute. What's interesting about that, go to that repository, look at the statistics of how many individual contributors there are to that rule set. It's actually a lot smaller than you think. It's pretty small. And what are the reasons for that? Is it because we don't want to collaborate? No, right? It's because of some of these other challenges we talked about. Does everyone in this room actually understand how to fork and do a pull request on GitHub to do an update on an issue? I bet you a lot of you don't. I mean, like I don't write code anymore as part of my day job, so every time I have to do this stuff, I have to like relearn it sometimes, because like Git's not the most, you know, intuitive thing. So to expect all of your SOC engineers to understand that, it's a higher bar, right? We need some purpose-built platforms that are made to do this, that are targeted towards cybersecurity professionals. You know, one of the other challenges that we have is, you know, someone else builds this defense. Can I trust the defense? How do I know if it's going to work for me, right? Can standards help? You know, the Sigma repository is interesting again because there's thousands of these rules, and you know, there's work being done right now to try to figure out, okay, how do we rank those rules? How do we know which ones are good, which ones are kind of not so good? Because it's an open community. And it's not necessarily about trust. It's not like there's adversaries in there necessarily, but it's like how robust is it? Is it, you know, can it be improved? So how can standards help with some of this stuff? So there's this notion of how open security can help lead to collective defense. And I'm not gonna spend any time going through all this this slide, because there's a lot of alphabet soup here. But there's a spectrum, there's an evolution journey that you go on that starts with this idea of foundational standards, and it moves to, you know, sharing of threat intelligence, and then we kind of get to this end game of what I call collective defense. And most of the industry is kind of on the left-hand side, and you know, the more mature folks are in the middle of this journey. There's very few, and I would argue perhaps almost none, are on the far right of the slide. And this is where we as an industry need to be trying to get to. You know, sharing, cross-platform threat hunting, shared response runbooks, linkages from the intel to the detection, to the response, to the policy enforcement, right? So that we're trying to create that consistency, sharing our knowledge, sharing our expertise, helping with the skills shortage. So let's talk a little bit about these standards, right? So I said alphabet soup. I'm going to take you on a lightning speed journey through a bunch of open security standards with a use case that kind of walks you through how some of this stuff can help. So imagine you're a software developer. You're building something, and that something has what's called an SBOM, software bill of materials, so I can tell what vulnerabilities exist inside that software, because I've gone and shared that as a publisher. So now say a threat actor is coming in with a certain attack pattern that's targeting one of those vulnerabilities. Well, I know from the SBOM that I'm actually probably am vulnerable to it. So I want, you know, then a threat intelligence community, and let me pause this animation because it tends to loop. Okay. I can then share that information using sticks and taxi to my community. Damn it. Sorry. I wasn't able to figure out in PowerPoint how to stop a GIF from looping in your presentation. So anyway, I could use sticks and taxi to share the threat intelligence that has the indicator in it that's tied to that attack pattern. And then I can have that threat intelligence tied to a Cacao playbook, which tells me what I should do when I see that certain threat. And using OpenC2, that playbook can actually automate the response on my endpoints. So OpenC2 is a standard that lets you say, I want to quarantine an endpoint, and then let individual implementations of actuators decide how that quarantine will work, because quarantining an endpoint in CrowdStrike works different from SentinelOne, works different from, you know, if I'm just, you know, Velociraptor or some other DFI or tool. So what happens when we start to tie these things together, right? So we've got these open standards where if people collaborate around intelligence using these standards, we know they can now be used in many different environments. And then we've got this defense ops where we're taking that stuff that we're creating using those standards and we're continuously improving and validating it. And then we're collaborating on all of this in the open, right? So we're not just doing this in our own organization. but we're doing it at a minimum inside my ISAC or ISAO, but ideally, the majority of the time, we're actually doing it in public, right? This would be a game changer in terms of being able to keep up with the adversary. There's a lot of, I wanted to highlight this organization that was recently formed called Nonprofit Cyber. Nonprofit Cyber is an umbrella coalition that was created about a year and a half ago at RSA. And the reason nonprofit cyber is relevant in this conversation is because there are a lot of groups that are kind of like-minded in this notion of improving collaboration in cybersecurity. And until recently, they were challenged because, I like to think of myself sometimes as a dot connector in open security because I'm kind of in a lot of different things. I try to cross-pollinate as much as possible. Because one of the things that kind of drives me crazy is when you see Group A tackling a problem and Group B is tackling the exact same problem. Everybody has all the best intentions, but because A and B don't know they necessarily exist, they develop either competing things or things that wouldn't be as good as if they had worked together, right? So the whole point of nonprofit cyber is it's trying to fight that, right? So there's actually this registry that's published and maintained by all of these organizations that talks about what are the key projects that we're working on, what are the things that we own that we're providing the community, and it's to help with that kind of collaboration. So that's another exciting thing that's going on that I think is going to help with collective defense intelligence. So if some of these ideas are interesting to you, like how can you help, right? How can you help level up and improve this? There's a couple of different things that organizations can do. The first is try to learn more, be that dot connector, right? So when you're in a SIG and that SIG is doing a topic and that topic might be, related to another activity that's going on in the open, let the folks know. Try to be some of that dot connector, and you can do that by learning more about all of these different organizations and what they're doing. Second is, in your organization, try to push to be part of that system. Always try to push to do things in the open. And, if you have the bandwidth, contributing code, contributing tooling, contributing detections is always ideal. But not everybody has the bandwidth, and you don't have to. Everybody doesn't have to always be the contributing party, right? As long as you're spreading awareness and you're consuming from these organizations, you're actually helping with the mission. And then finally, and then there's contributing and collaborating on kind of the detections and response plans, because that's kind of the thing I'm trying to push on now. We're doing a lot better with threat intel than we used to. I think everyone kind of understands threat intel now. MISP is extremely popular. We've broken down a lot of the legal barriers to sharing threat intel. So we've kind of, it's not a solved problem for sure, but we're a bit further beyond. But sharing detections, response plans, hunt scenarios, we're very nascent. Very nascent. We have a long way to work there. My last slide, just want to highlight an event that we're going to be hosting in September. OASIS is having a conference called Cybersecurity Meets Privacy, the Borderless Cyber series. And if you're interested in talking about this stuff more, that would be a great event to attend. Or the call for papers is actually still open. It closes at the end of next week, so it's been open for a while. I got them to hold it because of the first con. I was like, well, you should hold it a week just in case people want to submit something after they hear about it. So with that, that's the end of my talk. If anyone wants to reach out, that's my contact information. The QR code goes to my LinkedIn. And I think I've got a couple of minutes left for questions. I won't take a question from this guy.
What's your opinion on this trend? What's your kind of the opinion on like this SOAR trend of trying to replace? You mentioned like you don't have basically developers in cybersecurity operations because they're not trained as developers, and there's this kind of fallacy, I think, where people say, well, we'll give you a visual coding tool and suddenly you can do very good detection engineering. To me, it's more like shifting the problem to another problem and say, okay, now you need to learn this kind of coding, which is kind of visual and everything will be fine. What's your kind of take on that? Like, do you think it's sustainable or like we should?
Are you talking about like low code, no code?
Yeah, platforms,
like in SOAR?
Yes,
or
in SOAR, yeah.
You're talking about detections or in SOAR?
Yes. SOAR, let's talk about more SOAR, yeah.
Yeah, I think, so SOAR, it's interesting, right? Because the other thing that's going on in SOAR is, at the large language model AI BOF there yesterday, people were talking about, one of the individuals is using large language models to, I don't know if you want to call it replace SOAR, but augment SOAR, because you can go into large language model and you can say, hey, I want you to write me some Python code that takes this data and enriches it using the abuse.ch feed, and then if the value is greater than 10, then I want you to send a command to CrowdStrike to quarantine the endpoint. And it will, like, you can type that in English, and then it'll literally generate the Python for you, right? So, there's a lot of debates on, is the code actually work? How trustworthy is it? And you kind of have to be a subject matter expert to kind of evaluate that. But like, if we can get to that point, like, it becomes very interesting for SOC people who might not have a SOAR tool, right, to kind of bridge that gap and write some of these automations themselves. I do think, regardless of that, and regardless of building things in low code, no code, I want to get to the point that we're sharing this stuff and collaborating on, so in this case, it would be OpenC2 and Cacao, right? Whereas Cacao is the playbook, the response plan, the incident management process, and then OpenC2 is the automation, right? So when I see this, I want to take this action, and OpenC2 is a way to describe that in a vendor-neutral way. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us as a community to, like, say, create repositories of common playbooks and tie those to specific threat actors and campaigns. And, when you see this is an action that you should take. And again, going back to the earlier conversation around composability, when you do that properly, you can actually reuse that work across many different campaigns and threat actor combinations because it's all composable. Right? It's not tied to that specific one. And yeah, are organizations going to necessarily be able to consume the playbook and use it right in their org? No, probably not. You often have to customize it. But again, that 80-20 rule, 80% of the work is done for you, and you only have to do 20%. That is well worth the effort, right? We shouldn't say just because something's not perfect, we shouldn't do it.
And with that, we don't have time for any more questions. Please thank our speaker once again, and be sure to fill out your session evals.